Greetings, everyone. This is a special event that Sibylline Press is holding for lovers of historical fiction, women who are contemplating the meaning of the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 years ago. This is the anniversary of that event. We're going to ask our authors to correlate some of their um, character experiences, the development of their characters with some of our historical significance. So um, I'm going to pull this back to gallery for a minute. I want to welcome all of you, and I want to introduce our two authors who are will be speaking here today. Suzanne Samuels is the author of Seeds of the Pomegranate, which is a historical fiction that's coming out in 1 week or less, I guess. It's September 2nd. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about it when she speaks, but we're really looking forward to this. This is one of our 7 trade titles that we're publishing this fall. Barbara Vanier has a book called Little Bird, and this is a fiction that was just published. Gosh, was it 2 weeks ago, Barbara? And is already kind of taking the we're getting a lot of response on it. And possibly, when you see the covers of both these books, I'll have you both hold them up. You'll see why. It really speaks to what the book's about, and they are beautiful covers. There's Barbara's. It's called Little Bird. And uh, Suzanne, do you have yours with you?
No, I don't.
I do.
Working up here.
So let me just.
Yay! I'm down just to one copy and it's upstairs.
Yeah, this is the copy of
Oh,
Seeds of the
so you
Pomegranate.
can beautiful. See how
Right.
similar they are. Oh, wow, beautiful.
Beautiful books, just so you can have a visual of, what we're
Yeah.
talking about today. So I'm going to have each of the women describe, just in a couple sentences what their book's about, so we have a context for the rest of the discussion. And so, Barbara, would you like to go first?
Sure. So my book is about a young Russian girl whose father betroths her to a very wealthy cousin in New York because there's increased violence in Russia. He wants to keep the family safe. They come to New York. Her husband is not happy and he's cruel. And eventually she gets up the nerve to leave him, has an affair with someone she thinks is the love of her life, but doesn't turn out that way. And she gets a great job using her embroidery skills, and she's determined, okay, now I have the life. I make my own decisions. I'm happy with my work. I'm done. I don't need another man. And then, of course, she meets somebody and she has to decide if she can give up that independence for the life she had imagined as a wife and mother. And I'll let you read it to find out what happens. And it takes
Thank
place between 1910 and 1917.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Suzanne. Let's hear a little bit about Seeds of the Pomegranate.
All right, so here it is. Seeds of the Pomegranate. Um, so Seeds of the Pomegranate takes place in Sicily and New York City at the turn of the 20th century and features the protagonist, Mimi Inglese, who's a very talented artist and the daughter of a nobleman in Sicily, who wants to be the first woman ever admitted to the Palermo Art Academy. And she is hopeful that that is her fate in life. And then she contracts tuberculosis and is told she can never paint again. And she can also never marry or have children. And so she's sort of in this situation of trying to figure out what her life is. And in the midst of this, the family loses its fortune and goes to New York City. When she's there, she realizes that probably all along the plan was for her to be in New York City because the family is involved, the father is involved in the really very complicated counterfeiting plot, and her artistic talents are very much needed. And so it's a story of how Mimi really comes to understand her place in the family and in the wider world. And it's throughout the story is the question of whether she can kind of take agency, whether she can become the master of her fate. And that is the question that she struggles with throughout the novel.
It's interesting to me how similar the quest is in both books for women to find their voice, essentially. So that parallel with women's struggles over, to find their voice by having the right to vote, it's very related. And I just love that we're discussing both of those books today in connection with that. So, you know, they were different eras, both books, and from the era we're in today, and yet there was that struggle, probably more prevalent because of the history, for equality. Let's talk about, a woman's position at those times. Go ahead, Suzanne, and then I'll have Barbara to pick it up.
It's really interesting. 125 years ago, right? Today is the ratification or the passage of the the 19th Amendment. And I was thinking a lot about this because in some ways it was a very hopeful time. People really did believe that this was the beginning of something different, especially for white women. I mean, for women of color, Black women, and immigrant women, they were cut out of the process. But for white women, they believed that this was the beginning of something new. And right away, Alice Paul, put out this new amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. And there's a lot of hopefulness about that women are finally going to be kind of the equals to men. And so I've been thinking about sort of where we are now, and sort of the range of history. And, we sort of it feels like we hit the height somewhere in the 70s, and we've been sort of falling short since. And I think a lot about the Equal Rights Amendment because I mean, I'm not the only one who sort of looks at what's happening politically today and says that if if sex was a protected class in the Constitution, there'd be a lot of stuff that wouldn't be happening today. There would be a lot more pushback, and that would be more difficult. So in a way, I find like there's this parallel, which is that women don't have control over their destinies. And we're kind of on the decline of it now. And in my story, Mimi really is struggling. She's someone who's an invalid. She's a woman and she's young, and she's trying to figure out how to have a voice, and she's an immigrant, and all those things today would also mark her as an outsider and someone who really does not have that much of a voice and is very much acted upon. And so for me, I feel like there are lots of parallels between the world Mimi lived in and our world today. Um, and,
Absolutely.
and
And,
sort of,
but also, to be honest, that was a tougher time for women. And I think myself, I mean, women had no say. They couldn't hold property, all the things that they couldn't do. So can you go on a little bit about that, talking about that particular time and how, a woman's choice really it didn't appear in any of her interactions in life, really.
I think that's obviously it's very true that there are certain legal protections that we have, and a lot of them are in state law, and that women didn't have. And, kind of no fault divorce is one of these, and the idea that women could have property and would be, the title to property would be in their names, and that is very true. But I think what I'm reacting to is this strange position that we're in.
Mm.
5 years ago, people were still talking like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that we didn't need the ERA because everything was enshrined in law. And we're now in a position, we're in such a different place in such a short time. And a lot of the discussion about why women shouldn't hold property, shouldn't be allowed to get divorced, should be central to the hearth and home, those currents of discussion are very, very prominent in, in Project 2025, in a lot of the most powerful circles. And so I think that's very true. And I certainly don't want to be a doomsayer, Vicki, but I also see something on the horizon where women have very little control of their destiny. And I think what's different now than 100 years ago is 100 years ago, women really realized they needed to band together as collective. I mean, workers movements really had started to take take hold. And I think to me, what's different now is we don't have that same sense of in numbers we have power. I don't think we have that same, we're such individualists now because of the political culture. So yes, you're right. And I think it will ultimately, wherever this goes, it will depend upon what state you live in,
Mhm.
as to what your rights are. Um, but it's concerning to me because I see a lot of the same arguments um, that were out 100 years ago and just accepted wholesale that
Yeah.
are now just in the most hallowed halls of government and business. So,
Okay, very good. Thank you. Barbara, did you want to speak to that point a little bit? The resonance you're finding with your book in these times, and then also maybe some sort of overview of the state of, your main character in her allotted time.
Yeah, well, one very specific example is when I read, I very often read a scene where uh, at that time she's Vega and her soon-to-be husband has changed her Yiddish name to an American name because he doesn't want his friends to know that he's marrying someone who just got off the boat. And her father is very angry. He's like, I gave her that name. It's her great-grandmother's name. Everybody came off some boat. This is a shame. And she tries to calm him down and she says, but you raised me to be a traditional wife, and that's what this family wanted. So, a traditional wife, I have to abide by his decision. And she doesn't convince her father, but she rationalizes why she's going along with it. And when I wrote the book, and I used the phrase traditional wife, meaning wife and mother, it didn't have the same meaning that it has now. And now when I read it, I kind of look around and think, well, is anybody appalled the way I am? I cringe because I think about the influencers touting trad wives, and I just don't get how mostly these young women don't see that that is not about finding fulfillment as a wife and mother and joy. That is about men having control over them. It's about power and control. And I know that's a political opinion. It's mine, and I stand by it. I have fought for many, many years to allow choices. And so I have a daughter who stayed home with her children and loved that life, and still they're grown, but she's still home. She doesn't work outside the home. Wonderful. But I feel like we're moving toward a lack of choices. And Little Bird is also like Mimi. Is it Mimi? But
yes.
she's looking for herself. And I know that in the 70s, I thought of equality kind of as equality with men. It was equality of opportunity, but yes, we wanted our own names on a credit card. We wanted the same jobs. We wanted the same salary. We wanted access to men's only clubs where decisions got made. I think that for Fanny, it's equality with younger American women. She comes here, they pass the Statue of Liberty, and everyone's thinking lady with the lamp, we're in the land of the free. And then she says, but not me, I'm not free. I don't even get to choose my own name. I didn't get to choose my own husband. And she reads a newspaper that still exists. It's now called the Forward. In Yiddish, it was called the Vorwärts. And, she reads about the oppression of workers, and she goes, yeah, they have no freedom and I have no freedom. So it's very much about her finding agency. She sees a young woman in her English class, she goes to night school, who is going to have a traditional life and a fairly traditional marriage, but she had a say in it. And she saw this man from the balcony and thought he was good looking and then got introduced. And she's a little bit jealous of her. And her future sister-in-law is studying to be a nurse. So she comes from a German Jewish family that had come over a lot sooner, and she went to school. So Fanny, when her younger sister is able to come over, says, well, she's going to look at her and see she has this life and she's making up her own mind. And what can I offer her? How to stay home and cook and clean. So I think equality can mean different things, but for For my heroine, it's really about decision making.
Mhm.
And she kind of gets there in the end, but she's not thinking now I'm equal to. She's thinking now I'm my own person.
Yeah. I like that. I like the freedom of opportunity and the freedom of choice as a tenet for feminism rather than
Mhm.
whatever the assumed role is. I do like that. And then also that you are, your own person and with your own choices. So that's really great. Is there something that in either of your characters, I'll ask you first, Barbara, since you're here, is that when you were researching the story and you were sort of like shocked or surprised to discover that women went through whatever, Fanny went through or Mimi went through. Was there something that kind of stood out like you went, oh my God, people don't know this?
Mhm. Well, I don't know if other people know this, but I didn't. And I was doing research about women immigrants, and in particular Jewish women immigrants. And I have to give a shout out to the Tenement Museum. And during COVID, especially, I was watching all their presentations online, and also to a digital archive called the Jewish Women's Archive. And I learned about the kosher butcher boycott of
Mhm.
1909.
Mhm.
So there was a kosher butcher like every other door on Orchard Street in the Lower East Side. And they got their meat from wholesalers, and the wholesalers dramatically raised the price of the meat. And these poor, uneducated immigrant women knew that they could not afford to feed their families, and so they organized. They had no education, they'd never done this before. Most of them didn't even speak English, and they got together and they organized a boycott. They went door to door in the tenements, convincing other women to not go and buy the meat. They stood outside with signs, they marched, they actually got arrested, and then the other women organized to raise money to help them. And they did something that really shocked me. They interrupted Saturday morning services in the synagogue. So I didn't
Mhm.
know this, but I guess there's some provision that if something is dangerous to the community, you can interrupt. So they're up in the balcony yelling down. And of course, the men would love to silence them, but they can't because the rule says if this is a danger, then they're entitled to talk. And they tell them why it's really important to have this boycott. And the other thing I found out is that they had their children with them. So as they were in the street, they were holding hands of these little girls who grew up to be the next generation of labor leaders. They did win a price reduction. It crept back over time, but I didn't know anything about that. And I think that Fanny, if she had lived there then, now she belonged to a wealthy family in Brooklyn. She wasn't on the Lower East Side, but she would have supported that cause. I don't think she would march because she's too shy, but she definitely would have been in favor of what they were doing because it was for their families. This wasn't a traditional labor strike. This was a price boycott so that they could feed their families.
Excellent. Suzanne, do you have something along those lines where you were surprised or sort of called out to history that something different had happened?
Well, I love what you're talking about, Barbara. I mean, that labor resistance history is so central to what's happening during that era. And then, of course, what follows with the laws that get passed to protect workers, and in particular women and children, is a very much an outgrowth of that. I guess, what I was, one of my favorite characters is a secondary character. Her name is Stella. And she is really, she's a real person, and she's really a criminal. Like, she was really like a dyed in the wood criminal. And I have a number of women who are real people, real factual people who are criminals who, I guess, you know, I was sort of surprised to see how central those characters were in, and this is Gangland, New York. And I always think about Gangland, New York as completely and utterly dominated by men, and that the women are, in the kitchen cooking, and they're not out there making the deals or doing the work. And I was just so astounded to find, to discover how prominent there were a number of really important women who were fantastic criminals, brilliant criminals, who were trying to make their way too. And they were not making any bones about why they were doing what they were doing. They were just trying to survive on the terms that they were given. And I have to remind myself that history is so layered and that things are so complicated. There's so much that is invisible. And I think part of what I love about writing is trying to, make what's invisible visible, including these characters, these real life characters. I mean, Stella Ferruta was she eventually like went into witness protection essentially because she ratted out all the guys after she spent a lot of time in prison. She figured out that she took her money and ran, and I really like that, and I feel like there's something about that it really appeals to me on some level. Not that I'm a criminal, but I do, there's something about that. If the world is not, if the rules don't really apply, then why do we have to play by them? And there's something that, um I mean, I'm a lawyer also. So it's sort of a crazy thing to say, right? But that there's something there that if the whole thing is rigged anyway, I think these characters, these people realized we better figure out what works for us individually. And for me, I tend to think of, because I've studied mass movements, I tend to think about masses. But it's helpful when I write fiction is wonderful for me because I have to stay with that one person. I have to stay with that small unit and really feel what they felt. And what they felt was complicated. It was really messy. And they did really dumb things and stupid things. And Mimi made a ton of mistakes. And I like that. If anything, that just makes me feel closer to them, um,
Yeah.
and more inspired by them. Um,
Well, you really opened a door here because that's where I was going next, which is about the craft. It's like, how does a woman in our era find, that true story of that woman at that time? I mean, she's maybe not in all the record books. She's not really to be found. And, how much is fact and how much is fiction? And how do you navigate that? Suzanne, go right ahead.
Well, so for me, um, Mimi was a real person. But she was completely invisible. She was my grandfather's aunt, and there was no record of her anywhere. But she existed, and she likely died to save my grandfather's life. It was a terrible tenement fire, and she perished, and they found her body in the room where my grandfather's two little brothers were also found. And so, some of it with Mimi was this kind of push me, pull you, because the men have, like, when I wrote this book, this over a long period of time, it had a lot of variations and a lot of characters. It had three protagonists at one point. Two of them were men, and one was Mimi. And the men are easy because they do hold property and they get drafted, and they have records that you can pull up from the National Archives. And the women are not, they're not present. And so a lot of what I was trying to figure out as I was struggling with her was like, who was she, and what did she want? And more importantly, what would she have wanted if she hadn't had to die in that fire? What life would she have had? And so for me, she's a factual person, meaning she has a birth and death record, an autopsy report. She traveled across on Sicily in 1906, and I have those records, but she is someone who doesn't leave much record, like a lot of women don't. And so, how to make her come alive, for me, she was alive from the minute I realized she very likely sacrificed herself. Because I think for me, that really, maybe especially at the time I was coming upon her, that really resonated with me. This idea that you'd make the ultimate sacrifice to save someone else. Um, and so I don't know a lot of things about her, but for me, what made her come alive were those very complicated choices, and ultimately the decisions she made, that she was forced to make, that she didn't make, were forced upon her. So in terms of the craft, I'm a researcher. I love to research, like I suspect a lot of you. I can get really caught in the research. But for me, where it comes most alive is where I imagine myself into the place of the person and really try to imagine myself with complicated choices, not things are not clear. And anyway, I don't know if that answers your question. I don't have a good
It really,
answer.
well, no, it was very nicely answered. And well, I think we should keep exploring this. And I want to hear what Barbara has to say about that same thing, that recreation or where you find your information about your character. Go ahead, Barbara.
So before we started, Suzanne and I were talking about how we're like mirror images of each other, and our books are so similar and our characters. So it kind of started for me. This book is inspired by my grandmother, and I have to constantly remind myself as well as readers that it's not about her, it's inspired by her. Because like Suzanne, I had no information. But the way it happened was someone sent me a picture of my grandparents, a very romantic picture, and I said, "Oh, I don't remember my grandparents being that affectionate." And the cousin who sent it to me said, "That's not our grandfather." So I kind of recalled a conversation I had had with my grandmother when I was getting a divorce. And she said, "Why are you doing that?" And I said, "Well, I there's not love in this marriage, and that's what I need." And she said, and this was way before Tina Turner, "What's love got to do with it?" And of course, it made me think that she was talking about her own life. She had been married to my grandfather, I think, 60 years, and I kind of got the feeling that it wasn't about love. But I didn't ask her. I was in my 30s then. I don't know. I guess we never really had that kind of relationship. I adored my grandmother. She spoiled me. I had two younger brothers. I got to stay with my grandparents by myself and dress up in her robe and felt like a queen. And but I never asked her. And so when it came time to write this story, I wanted to give her the life I think she would have wanted without any knowledge. um, and sometimes I think it's the life I wanted, so that I'm telling her story. I'm telling my own story about a woman who finds her way to the choices she wanted all along. And originally, I have to say, I thought the novel was going to end with her making a loveless marriage. And in the end, I couldn't do that. So it was about writing the story of a woman, a personal story, who finds agency, as Suzanne said, and is able to make decisions. And the research I did was to create opportunities for her to do that. So it wasn't so much because I want the reader to know what was going on in that period, but I chose events. And so one was a black boxer won the world championship in 1910. He defeated a white boxer. And there were riots all over the country, and hundreds of black people got killed. And her response to that is, well, we left Russia because of the violence against the Jews, and here we are in America, and people hate each other and kill each other. Why'd I come here? So I look for things like that that moved her thinking toward what was right in the world and what was wrong in the world. And in my book, she specifically thinks about suffrage. She reads about it, and her first reaction is, "Oh, that's terrible, because after the vote, women will want to run for office, and who will take care of the children?" And then she thinks, well, but maybe women will do a better job of making laws that are good for women and children. So everything that I put in historically was to help her get to that end point of figuring out who she was. And I love the research, and I know how easy it is to sort of drown in it, but willingly, to float in it. Let's put it that way, not drown in it. But I had to constantly pull back and say, what's the point of this? If I put this in the book, it has to be for her. It has to have an influence on her. It can't just be a fun story.
I just love this conversation so much because Sibylline has such a great category of historical fiction. And 201, it's sort of the unearthing of the early feminists. Like you create that feminist in her own era who fights back. Both you and Suzanne have done this and who find their way up. And they're not the real story. So we have the historical and then we have the fiction. And that fiction really is what creates that momentum behind the story. And it's something that women, just love to read because, here's a woman who has huge odds, each woman, Fanny and Mimi, and yet they rise above because Suzanne, your Mimi in real life did not even live. So, and you gave her life.
Yeah, that was I kept trying, because I kept trying to make it fit the facts, which was of course not wasn't leading me in a direction that made sense for the story, but it yeah, I mean, she didn't survive, and the only photo that survived of her is one that was in the newspaper report of her death. That's the only record there is of the outside world. So yeah, there was something about that I think
Yeah.
I wanted to rescue her from that silence, from that invisibility. Um,
Yeah, and it's not revisionist, but it's like hopeful. It's like it's a view of resistance, perhaps, that's sort of embedded in all historical fiction and just the first inklings of, women rising up. So I really commend both of you because that is I think it's the hardest story, but I also think it's a very creative act to find those places where you're going to shift the story. And it's not to gloss it over, but it's
mm,
to build it and to really, build that feeling for women. So we do have our connection to the 19th Amendment right there of women finding their voices in a way that maybe historically they didn't. So thank you very much. When you are searching for women's voices and then looking for that parallel today, was there a consciousness? I think you mentioned it, Suzanne, of bringing like current times sort of back, or did that just happen naturally?
Oh, for me, well, I guess probably both, right? I mean, there were some things that really happened in the story around reproductive rights that really happened in the story and are now happening again. There are things that really happened about immigration and about discrimination against immigrants that really happened and happen now. But, because we do what we do, my eyes seek out what seems important to me today, and it's impossible not to have it be what I do. I just what I there are things I care about. You know, I care about people's rights, and I care about freedom, and I care about women's rights in particular, and children's rights. And so those are the things that to me, I'm always sort of on the lookout. In all of my writing life, I have been, and with this book, and certainly with my next one, these are things that I know draw me in and make me really think long and hard about what it means to be visible or invisible, what it means to be resisting, how you square what you believe with what is expedient. And so yeah, I guess it's both for me. I can't get away from myself. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the part that it's a conversation. It just goes on.
Well, I mean, it's the lens you look through. So I think that's, it's inevitable. Barbara, what are your thoughts about that?
I think I'm going to share a very personal story because one thing that is important to me in my own life is also finding a sense of religious identity. Where do I belong as a feminist, which is very different than my upbringing and even back in the 80s, trying to remember how old, when I was raising my children and choosing to go to a place where they would be treated equally rather than being told, oh, go to Hebrew school for, 5 or 6 years, and then on Friday night you could light the candles rather than you could read from the Torah, like a boy could. And so I was thinking about how, again, what historical fact could I put in the book that would reflect what was going on in my grandmother's mind? And she did go, I mean, this is partly accurate. Henrietta Isolde, who founded Hadassah. Hadassah is now an international women's organization, but it was founded by Henrietta Isolde to send nurses to what was then Palestine. She had gone there and seen such incredible poverty and disease, and she wanted to send nurses to take care of anyone, regardless of their faith or nationality, and that is still the mission of Hadassah. And she did give a speech at Cooper Union, I think in 1915. And in the book, Fanny and her sister-in-law go with the man who's going to be her husband, who was enrolled in Cooper Union, which is also true. And they go to hear Henrietta Isolde. And Henrietta Isolde says that a woman is equally capable of fulfilling the obligations of the Jewish religion, as capable as any man. And in fact, when her mother died, a male colleague offered to say the prayer for the dead, which only men could say. And she said, no, I'll do it myself. And in the Jewish religion, there should be 10 men in order to say that prayer. And women don't count. And if they only have 9, they will not go forward, even if there are perfectly capable women right next to them. And Fanny is shocked when she hears that. And then she thinks her mother-in-law had died. And wasn't her grief the same as her husband's grief and the other men's grief? Why shouldn't she be able to honor someone she loved with that prayer? And again, this was inspired by something that actually happened with my grandmother. When my grandfather died, and he was an Orthodox Jew, so he would have been the one who said, well, if there's no man, we don't pray. And when he died, my grandmother said, women can be part of the 10 men, the minyan. And so I was able to, it's hard for me to even talk about this. I was able to say that prayer for my grandfather and my female cousins, although I will tell you that my grandmother did not. So she could like go this far, but no further. And the other thing that makes me think about this, when I got dressed, and I put this necklace on, right after my grandfather died, and he left my brother, my younger brother, more money than me because he was the first grandson. And even though I was the oldest, and I know he loved me, I was not a boy. And so my grandmother calls me into her room and she says, I know what your grandfather did, and it's not right. And I'm going to make it right. And she gave me this diamond heart, which it turns out was worth way more than the money that my grandfather left from my brother. So it's kind of, once he died, my grandmother was able to do things that she couldn't do while he was alive. And she certainly would never be like I am. And I don't know how she would have felt about women rabbis. I think it would have taken her time to adjust, but she would have. You know, she was open to those possibilities. So my finding what Henrietta Isolde said, which she didn't say at that speech, she wrote in a letter, I made it fit the story so that Fanny could think about her religion the way I am thinking about mine. And it's a journey, you know,
Yeah.
and it's still going on.
Yeah. Really shows that whole generational shift in what we bring to our daughters and what we bring to our children and, and the people before us and all the legacies. So it's so, and you both have that vantage point because you are writing from initially these, real people. So that's amazing. I would love to know if Mimi or Fanny was standing here or on Zoom, which they would be totally shocked by, if they were here with us today, what would they say in terms of advice to women right now? What flag would they say? Go here, do this. What would be the one bit of advice you think that they would give? Do you want to start, Barbara, or what do you think?
I think she would say, wow, I can't imagine. I could never have imagined what you have now, but you have to fight for it. You have to preserve it. You have to keep it for the women coming after you. It's worth it. And then she would use the phrase, be brave. Because at the beginning of this book, she promises her mother, I will be brave, but she doesn't believe that she has that in her, and she then proves over her journey that she does. So I think she would say to women, you have a battle. This is not a done deal. You have a battle. You've got to fight it because there are women coming after you.
Very good. Suzanne, what do you
Um,
think Mimi would say?
so I think Mimi would, I think Mimi would say, be brave. I mean, I think she would say, think about where you come from. She would be very reticent to say any of this, but to herself, she'd be saying, the idea of choosing, which is at the heart of Seeds of the Pomegranate and of the Persephone story, the Persephone myth that's, thousands of years old, is the idea that you can make a choice, and that choice isn't going to be a simple one. It isn't going to be all good or all bad. Most choices are somewhere in between. And I think Mimi would say, make a choice. Don't let the world go by with just standing there because you're not sure what to do. That being bold is a big part of that. And again, she would be very hesitant in saying that, but I think that's the lesson she eventually comes to, is that she needs to live her own life and she needs to make her own choice. So,
Yeah, that's lovely. I think I was struck also, I think both of you mentioned this lack of, or this part of being a community of women to move forward. I think Suzanne, you talked about it even today, that is sort of broken down in some ways, and was the saving grace of
Mm.
our grandmothers, that they and our yeah, that they had each other. What would you suggest around building that community again?
Mhm.
I love that question.
I'm asking you to
Love
save the
that.
universe with that question, so go right ahead.
Um, Barbara, can I go first? Are you still thinking? Do
I'm
you,
still thinking.
um, so I think we need to lean into our sisters, I'm not talking about our biological sisters. I'm talking about the community of women. And I think ultimately this is what Mimi does. And I think ultimately this is what women do, is they recognize that they have much more in common with each other than they do, um, than they're at odds with each other. And I think the writer community, I think being in a community of writers is a real salve for this time, that there's people um, who are feeling things deeply, or trying to make sense of things that make no sense. And I think religious community can do that as well. I think workplace community can do that, but I think not to think you're alone, to realize that you're surrounded by people, and history has been about collective. It's not been about the individual. It's never been about the individual until late capitalism. It really hasn't been. It's been about people figuring out how to do stuff together. And usually, in matriarchal or patriarchal lines, it usually has been communities of people doing specific things. So I guess that's, that I feel like that's, don't be disheartened, and try to still speak, try to still have something to say in this world, which is a very terrible and terrifying world right now. Just try to be brave, and try to look around you and see the people who share with you your values, and don't go back. I mean, I don't know, that it's such a hard time, I think, for all of us, but I do think it's in community, like Together We Rise. I really do think that that is how we're going to get through this, whatever it looks like. And I'm not saying it's going to be good when we get to the other side of it. I'm saying that we have to stay together in whatever ways we can. So,
Thank you. Barbara, you don't have to talk about that topic, but did you have a closing
There's
thought?
one thing
Yeah.
I would add to that. So I'm having an event in 2 weeks that I invited a lot of local people to and family to, and it's being held at a coffee shop owned by a trans woman, and it caters very much to the gay and trans community and has that reputation. And I fell in love with it because it's just a beautiful place. And when my daughter came up to see it, she said, "Well, Mom, are you sure this is the message that you want to give?" And I said, "I'm not giving a message. I'm patronizing a place whose people I like. And if I let that border exist between me and them, then neither of us gets where we need to be." So it's sort of a reiteration of what Suzanne said. You have to find community and you have to find it with people not like you. And I think what has fractured us is that we've allowed the community to break apart. Well, if you're Black, you can't be interested in what I'm interested in. And if you're straight, well, then you don't know anything about my life. Well, yes, we do. What we share is the woman's experience, whether you were born that way or you choose to be that way. I mean, life is so much more complicated now than it was just a few years ago. You know, when I was president of my last college, we put up a building that was health professions. And so we knew that the overwhelming majority of people in that building would be female. So we created potty parity and we put in a lot more bathrooms. Well, 3 years down the line, that's all it took was 3 years. We didn't have all gender bathrooms. It was not an issue when we were planning that building. So things are changing, but we can't let them divide us. And I want to put in a plug for Sibylline because I think to me this writing community and looking at all these Sibyls on the call, it really means a lot. I don't have a writing life, Suzanne, or I have a very recent writing life, and I appreciate being able to reach out to other writers to say, well, how did you do this? Because I'm working on my next book about a man, and it's going to be a whole other experience for me. And I appreciate having other writers in my community.
I am just thrilled with this conversation and talking to you both. And I'd just like to remind people about the books you've written. Um, Little Bird has been written, and it's a historical fiction. It's fabulous. It's just out. It's on the Sibylline website, but it's also, in all the bookstores, or it's in on all the online sites. So I'd ask you to look for it there. And Suzanne's book, Seeds of the Pomegranate, comes out next Tuesday, and there'll be a lot of hoopla there, just the same as Barbara just had with, we'll be sending out announcements about it, and you'll find that book in all the right places as well. So, I think one of the things the community of readers can do for women writers is to spread the word about their books. And so I really appreciate each of you being here. But if you've read it and you've loved a book, the best thing after that is sharing the book. So I would invite you to do that. And we welcome that kind of support all the time. I'm thinking about ending it there, unless someone has a burning a question that they want to ask either author. I'll pause a minute. You can just take off your mute and offer it if you'd like. I feel like that conversation was a whole conversation from beginning to end. And so I feel like that a lot was said there about, where we've come as women and where we still need to go. So thank you both, because I feel, you've shared your book, but you've also shared a part of your thinking, and you've shared your heart. So that's a big share. Thank you all for coming, and we'll be putting this up on YouTube for other people to enjoy. So thanks so much.